She told the police she lived at the station, moments before a billionaire stopped beside her and her entire life changed. The station was unusually loud that evening, filled with rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, faint announcements echoing overhead, and the metallic rumble of incoming trains. Travelers rushed past in warm coats and scarves, eager to get somewhere else, someone else, anywhere but here. Yet in the middle of this restless river of people stood a tiny stillness, a 5-year-old girl in a white dress and a red jacket, her curly blonde hair damp from melted snow, her blue eyes too wide and too alert for a child her age. At her feet rested a bright red suitcase scuffed at the corners, as if it had been dragged far longer than her small arms could reasonably manage. 2 police officers knelt in front of her, trying to make sense of why such a young child was alone at a busy train station. The girl pressed her lips together, gripping the suitcase handle with both hands like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. When one of the officers gently asked where she was going, she lifted her chin with a mix of fear and stubbornness and whispered, almost defiantly, that she wasn't going anywhere at all. She wasn't traveling, she wasn't lost, she wasn't waiting for a train. She lived here now. The officers exchanged helpless looks, unsure whether they had misheard or whether the child truly believed the station was her home. Before they could ask more questions, a tall man walking by slowed his steps, caught by the quiet insistence in the child's trembling voice. Andrew Collins recognized distress when he heard it, even in strangers. He had come to the station only to check on a regional logistics project, but the moment he saw the small girl standing alone amidst chaos, something inside him tensed sharply. His tailored light blue suit stood out among the winter coats, his brown hair neatly styled, his blue eyes sharp with the practiced awareness of a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms rather than train platforms. But right now none of that mattered. He found himself walking toward the officers before he consciously decided to. He wasn't sure if it was the size of the suitcase or the fact that the girl's shoes were slightly wet from slush or the way she tried so hard not to cry, but the sight rooted him to the ground. The fact that she didn't look away from him as he approached, only stared with a quiet mix of fear and hope, pulled at something he didn't know he still had. The officers stepped aside to give him space, recognizing him instantly, and Andrew crouched down slowly so he could be eye level with the child. He didn't speak right away. He let the moment breathe, giving her a chance to decide whether he was safe. Her small fingers twisted around the handle of her suitcase, knuckles pale, shoulders trembling under her red jacket. When he finally asked her name, she answered in a whisper that cracked at the edges, as though the word had been buried under too many unshed tears. Emma. It hit him harder than he expected. A name shouldn't have the power to break a man open, yet here he was, staring at a child who was trying with all her strength not to fall apart. The officers explained what little they knew, that she refused to leave the station, that she insisted she lived here, that no guardian had appeared. Andrew felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter seep into him. He asked Emma where her parents were, but she only lowered her eyes and gave the same heartbreaking answer she'd given the officers. Her mother had left. She had promised to return. And she didn't. Emma wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She was abandoned with a suitcase and a fading memory of someone who loved her. People continued to rush by, oblivious, their world spinning in its usual rhythm while the girl's world stood broken at the center of it. Andrew realized that whatever business had brought him here no longer mattered. Not compared to this. Not compared to her. Something inside him, something long neglected, something human and fiercely protective, snapped awake. And without fully knowing why, he understood one thing with absolute clarity: this little girl's life had just collided with his for a reason. And he wasn't walking away. Emma didn't move when Andrew sat down on the cold metal bench beside her, but he noticed the way her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle as if she expected someone to take it away. The officers tried gently to continue their questions, asking where she had been sleeping and whether she remembered a phone number or an address, but the girl only shook her head in small, jerky motions. She looked exhausted in a way that didn't belong to childhood. Her cheeks were pale from cold, her lashes damp from holding back tears for too long, and her voice cracked each time she tried to answer. Andrew placed his coat over her shoulders without asking. She stiffened, startled, but didn't push it off. Instead, her eyes lifted slowly toward him, searching his face with a mix of confusion and disbelief, as if kindness was something she no longer recognized. He spoke softly, asking her if she was hungry, if she was cold, if she wanted to sit somewhere warmer. She shook her head at first, insisting she had to stay here. Her mother might come back. Her mother always told her to wait exactly where she was. Her mother said she would return soon. Andrew felt the officers prepare to intervene, but he raised a hand subtly to stop them. He could see the fear behind Emma's stubbornness, the panic she hid beneath her insistence that she lived here now. This wasn't defiance, this was desperation. He realized she wasn't refusing help, she was terrified that help meant losing the last place where she felt connected to her mother. He shifted slightly so she could see that he wasn't trying to take anything from her. He asked how long she had been waiting. This time she whispered something so quiet he barely caught it. Days. Maybe more. She didn't know exactly. She had slept sitting up on benches, clutching her suitcase so no one would steal it. Sometimes she begged for food, sometimes kind strangers gave her leftovers. She hadn't gone home because there was no home left. She hadn't gone to authorities because she believed they would take her away and her mother would never find her again. Every sentence she spoke carved a deeper wound in Andrew's chest. He asked gently about her father, but she only blinked at him, confused by the question. She didn't have one, she said. Mom said he didn't want them. That he left before Emma was born. Emma told the story with the same tone as someone explaining the weather, simple fact, accepted long ago. But Andrew saw the flicker of sadness she tried to hide, the small tremors that ran through her hands. The officers stepped aside to radio their supervisor, but Emma heard something in their tone, something official, something final. She shot up from the bench immediately, clutching her suitcase, her voice rising in panic. She begged them not to take her away, insisting she wasn't causing trouble, she didn't need anything from anyone, she just needed to stay where her mother would find her. Her breath hitched, turning into frantic sobbing as she backed away, pressing herself against the metal railing like a cornered bird. Andrew stood slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. He approached her with careful, measured steps, speaking softly but with deep certainty. He told her no one was going to separate her from her mother. No one was going to remove her from the station unless she wanted to leave. She blinked at him through tears, still trembling, still not believing. He knelt beside her again, meeting her at eye level. He told her she deserved warmth, food, rest, and safety, that none of that meant forgetting or abandoning her mother. He promised that he wouldn't let anyone take her somewhere she didn't want to go. For a moment it seemed she might collapse from exhaustion and fear. Her little shoulders shook, her breath came in sharp gasps, and her fingers dug painfully into the suitcase handle. Then, as if something inside her slipped, she whispered the first honest fear she had allowed herself to say aloud, she didn't know if her mother was ever coming back. The words cracked through the air like glass breaking. Andrew felt his heart twist painfully. He reached out slowly, giving her time to recoil if she wanted, but Emma didn't pull away when his hand rested gently on her shoulder. Instead she sagged toward him, her legs nearly giving out from everything she had held inside. He caught her before she fell, holding her with surprising tenderness. She was shaking so violently he wasn't sure how she had been able to stand at all. The officers approached again, but this time they stopped when they saw Emma's small hands clutching desperately at Andrew's suit jacket. She had chosen him, instinctively, blindly, the way frightened children grasp the safest thing they see. And for reasons he didn't yet understand, Andrew felt a fierce, overwhelming instinct rise in him. He would protect her. He didn't know how, he didn't know why, and he didn't know what would come next. But as he lifted her into his arms and felt her bury her face against his shoulder, he knew one thing with absolute clarity. He would not let this child face the world alone ever again. Andrew carried Emma through the station with slow, steady steps, careful not to startle her further. She clung to him with surprising strength for such a small child, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her face hidden against his shoulder as if the world behind her had become too frightening to look at. Her red jacket brushed against the front of his suit, leaving faint traces of dust from the station benches, but he didn't care. At that moment, she wasn't a stranger's child or a problem to be delegated, she was a terrified little girl who had spent far too long without safety, and she had chosen him as her anchor. The officers walked beside him, giving updates on paperwork and emergency protocols, but Andrew barely absorbed their words. His mind was on the trembling weight in his arms, the soft hiccups of a child trying to hold back tears she could no longer contain. When they reached a quieter corridor away from the busy platform, Andrew lowered Emma onto a bench, but she refused to release him fully. Her hand clung to his sleeve, her fingers gripping the fabric as if she feared he might vanish if she let go. He sat beside her and allowed her to keep holding on, giving her the sense of control she desperately needed. Her breathing began to slow, though her eyes still darted anxiously toward the main hall. She whispered that she didn't want the officers to take her away, and he reassured her again, with steady conviction, that she was safe with him and no one would make decisions without her consent. Once she calmed enough to speak, Andrew encouraged her to tell him what had happened. She explained in fragmented pieces. Her mother had been sick for weeks but insisted everything was fine. One night she woke to find her mother gone, the apartment door left slightly ajar, her mother's shoes missing, her wallet gone. The neighbor said she had left earlier that evening, saying something about needing help, and never returned. Emma didn't know what else to do. She packed her small suitcase with the only things she cared about, her favorite dress, a picture she drew for her mother, and a stuffed rabbit, and went to the only place she could think of, the train station where her mother last said she would go. She waited day and night, too afraid to ask strangers for help, too determined to remain in the place her mother told her to stay. Andrew listened with increasing dread. The pieces didn't add up. No responsible mother would abandon a child so abruptly unless something terrible had happened. He suspected illness, an accident, or something far worse. He made a silent promise that he would find her. A cold breeze from the platform made Emma shiver, and Andrew noticed the thinness of her dress beneath the jacket, the slight tremor in her hands, the fatigue in her posture. She hadn't slept properly in days. She hadn't eaten enough. She had been living in survival mode, her fragile world shrinking to the size of a train platform. He stood and extended a hand. She hesitated before taking it, as if afraid the moment might disappear like a dream. "I'm going to take you somewhere warm," he said gently. "You can rest, and you can eat. We'll figure this out together." Emma's eyebrows pinched in uncertainty. "But, what if Mommy comes back and I'm not here?" Andrew crouched so they were eye level again, his voice steady and calm. "If your mother comes back, we'll make sure she knows exactly where you are. But right now she would want you to be safe. Not scared. Not hungry. She would want you to be taken care of." Emma's throat bobbed as she swallowed, torn between fear and trust. Finally, her small hand tightened around his. "Okay," she whispered. With the paperwork handled and a temporary protection agreement signed by officers who knew better than to argue with a man of Andrew's influence, he walked Emma to his car. She stared at it in awe, not because of its luxury but because she hadn't ridden in a car with an adult she trusted in a very long time. When he opened the door, she climbed in slowly, looking around as if entering an unfamiliar world. As Andrew started the engine, he glanced back at her through the rearview mirror. She sat hugging her suitcase tightly to her chest, her chin resting on the top of it, studying him with wide, cautious eyes. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She wasn't sure she deserved anything better than the cold bench at the station. But she was willing to trust him, at least for now. He drove to the nearest warm, well-lit cafe. Inside, the scent of fresh pastries and hot soup filled the air. Emma followed him closely, keeping her hand wrapped around the corner of his jacket. When he ordered her a bowl of chicken noodle soup, she stared at it as though she wasn't certain it was really for her. She took small bites at first, then faster, as her hunger overcame her hesitation. Watching her eat quietly, almost shyly, Andrew felt something heavy settle in his chest, a mixture of anger, protectiveness, and something far more personal. This child had suffered more in a week than most people experienced in a lifetime. When she finally lifted her eyes to him again, they were softer, less fearful. "Are you going to leave too?" she asked in a barely audible voice. "Like Mommy did?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke with complete sincerity. "No, Emma," he said. "I'm not leaving you." She blinked hard, as if trying to hold back tears again, but this time they were different, less of fear, more of relief wrapped in disbelief. For the first time since he found her, she allowed herself to hope. Andrew stayed with Emma at the cafe until the evening rush began to fade and warm light settled over the quiet tables. She had eaten slowly at first, unsure whether she was allowed to, then hungrily, then sleepily, as the exhaustion she had held back for days began to catch up with her. When her eyelids started to flutter, Andrew realized she was fighting desperately to stay awake, as if letting herself fall asleep might cause the world to shift again in ways she couldn't handle. He asked gently if she wanted to rest, but she shook her head quickly, clutching her suitcase with renewed determination. She didn't want to stay in one place too long. She didn't want to make herself vulnerable. She didn't want to give anyone the chance to take her away from the only place she had known as home for the past several days. Understanding her fear, Andrew suggested they take a walk outside to clear their heads. He kept his pace slow and steady so her small legs could keep up. She walked close beside him, almost brushing his coat with every step. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but she didn't complain. Instead she asked him quiet questions: where he worked, why he wore such a nice suit, why he had stopped to help her. Andrew answered everything honestly, though he left out the part where he felt something shift inside him the moment he saw her standing alone at the station. He didn't want to overwhelm her, but he also didn't want to lie. So he told her simply that anyone with a heart would have done the same, though even he knew that wasn't true. Many people had walked past her before he arrived. Emma listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail with the seriousness of someone who had learned early that information could be a lifeline. After a moment she asked whether he had any children. He shook his head. She seemed surprised, almost disappointed, and he wondered what she had expected. Then, in a small voice, she said that he seemed like someone who could be a dad. It wasn't a request. It was an observation, a quiet, earnest one, and he felt the words land with startling weight. They walked until the sky turned darker and the city lights softened the cold edges of the evening. Andrew led her to his car again, and this time she climbed in without hesitation, pulling the seatbelt across her lap like she'd watched adults do. He drove her to a nearby hotel with a warm lobby and a welcoming staff, choosing a suite with 2 rooms so she would never feel trapped or confined. At the front desk, Emma pressed herself close to him, watching the exchange as though trying to decipher an unfamiliar ritual. When they entered the room, she paused on the threshold, staring at the soft beds, the clean carpet, and the warm light glowing from the lamps. He realized suddenly that she wasn't just quiet, she was overwhelmed. She touched the blanket of the nearest bed as if it wasn't real. Andrew offered her a set of pajamas the hotel provided for children. She accepted them with both hands, almost reverently. When she emerged from the bathroom, the pajamas too big but adorable, she looked at him with uncertainty, as though asking permission to exist comfortably in this space. He nodded and smiled, and only then did she tentatively climb onto the bed. While she settled in, Andrew stepped aside to call his assistant. He needed someone discreet to begin searching for Emma's mother, hospital admissions, police records, emergency rooms. Every lead needed checking. He spoke quietly, careful not to alarm Emma, but she watched him from the bed, hugging a pillow to her chest. Even half asleep, she wanted to know that he wasn't making arrangements to send her away. When he finished the call, he sat in a chair near her bed. She pushed herself up slightly. "Are you leaving?" she asked, and her voice broke just a little, betraying her fear. "No," he said immediately. "I'm staying right here until you fall asleep." She exhaled shakily and lowered her head back onto the pillow, reassured enough to let her body relax. After a moment she whispered something unexpected. "Do you think Mommy will be mad at me for leaving the station?" Andrew felt something inside him twist painfully. He moved his chair closer and answered softly, "Your mom would never be mad at you for being safe." Emma thought about that, gripping the corner of the blanket. "But what if she comes back and I'm not there?" "She will want you warm and cared for," Andrew said. "She will want you alive and okay. That's what mothers want." For a long moment Emma didn't speak. Then she reached out her small hand toward him, not quite touching, but asking silently for reassurance. He took her hand gently, and she finally closed her eyes. Her breathing deepened. The tension in her shoulders eased. Sleep overtook her slowly, as though she had been resisting it for so long that her body had forgotten how to let go. Andrew remained at her bedside long after she drifted off. He watched her fragile chest rise and fall beneath the blanket, her curls fanned across the pillow, her small fingers still curled around his thumb. He felt the weight of responsibility settle over him, not imposed, not forced, but willingly accepted. This wasn't a temporary situation anymore. The moment he picked her up at the station, everything changed. He thought about the empty penthouse he returned to every night, the silence of it, the sterility, the way no one waited for him there. He looked at the sleeping child beside him and realized with startling clarity that he could never go back to that version of his life. Not after this. Not after her. Emma had walked into his world by accident, but she filled a void he hadn't known existed. She wasn't just a child in need, she was someone whose presence shifted the balance of his life in a way he couldn't ignore. And as he sat in the quiet room, watching her sleep, Andrew made an unspoken promise to the fragile little girl who had clung to him with all her strength. He wouldn't just protect her for tonight. He wouldn't just help her through tomorrow. He would not leave her. He would not fail her. He would find her mother, no matter what it took. Morning light filtered softly through the hotel curtains, casting pale gold across the room as Emma stirred beneath her blanket. Andrew had dozed in the chair beside her, but the slightest sound of her shifting woke him instantly. He sat up straighter, rubbing the tension from his neck, and saw her blinking sleepily, her curls a tangled halo around her small face. For a moment she looked disoriented, as though unsure where she was, and then her eyes found him. Her entire body relaxed at once, and he felt an unexpected wave of relief wash through him. She was safe, and she knew it. He greeted her gently, asking how she slept, and she answered with a timid but sincere, "Good." Her voice was rough with sleep, and he realized it might have been the first full night of rest she'd had in days. Still hugging her pillow, she asked softly whether he had found her mother yet. Andrew answered honestly that the search was ongoing, but he promised they were closer than they had been last night. She accepted this with a small nod, even though he saw the flicker of fear behind her eyes. She was bracing herself for disappointment. He ordered breakfast to the room, choosing dishes he thought a child might like: pancakes, fruit, warm oatmeal. When the cart arrived, Emma hesitated before touching anything, glancing at him as if asking for implicit permission. He smiled encouragingly and told her she didn't have to rush or ask. Only then did she pick up her fork, eating slowly at first with that same careful politeness that made her seem far older than her 6 years. At one point she paused to offer him a strawberry from her plate, an instinctive kindness that caught him off guard. He accepted it with a quiet thank you, feeling an ache in his chest he couldn't explain. While she ate, his phone buzzed with updates from his assistant. Andrew stepped aside to take the call, though he kept Emma within sight. The information came in fragments. A woman matching her mother's description had been admitted to a hospital 3 days earlier, disoriented and severely ill, unable to give her name. She had no identification on her and had been listed as an unidentified patient. The news hit him with a mixture of hope and dread. If it was Emma's mother, she was alive, but the fact that no one had been able to identify her all this time spoke volumes about how alone she had been. When he returned to the table, Emma set down her fork, reading his expression as if she had spent her entire life studying the moods of adults. She asked cautiously whether something was wrong. Andrew crouched beside her chair so she wouldn't have to look up at him and explained gently that they might have found her mother. Her breath caught in her throat and she grabbed the edge of the table, eyes wide and terrified of hope. She asked whether her mommy was okay, and he told her sincerely that they didn't know yet, but that the doctors were taking care of her. Emma slid off her chair, walked to him, and took his hand with both of hers. She whispered that she wanted to see her mother right now. Andrew didn't hesitate. He packed their things, settled the hotel bill, and took her to his car. She held her suitcase tightly on her lap during the drive, staring out the window with her chin quivering. At one point she asked whether her mother would be angry that she left the station. Andrew answered firmly that no mother would ever be angry at a child for wanting her safe. Emma didn't respond, but she squeezed the handle of the suitcase with white knuckles, as if holding herself together. When they arrived at the hospital, Emma's steps grew smaller and slower. Andrew placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, guiding her gently through the corridors. The closer they got to the room, the more she trembled. He knelt beside her again and told her that no matter what they found behind the door, she wouldn't face it alone. She nodded, though tears were already gathering at the corners of her eyes. A nurse briefed them quietly. The woman inside was weak, barely conscious at times, but alive. When the nurse opened the door, Emma froze completely, as though rooted to the floor. Andrew waited patiently, letting her take the moment she needed. Then she stepped inside, moving toward the bed on trembling legs. The woman lying there was pale and thin, her breathing shallow, her hair tangled around her pillow. Emma climbed onto the chair beside the bed, her small hand reaching out tentatively to touch her mother's arm. At the contact, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open just enough to reveal unfocused eyes. She exhaled weakly, a sound that was almost a sob. Emma leaned in, whispering, "Mommy," and the woman's fingers twitched, searching for her child's hand. Emma began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking, but she didn't let go. Andrew stayed near the door, giving them space while remaining close enough for her to see him if she looked up. He felt a tightness in his chest, watching the raw vulnerability of the scene. This was what Emma had needed all along, certainty that her mother was alive, love that didn't disappear overnight, a connection that hadn't been severed by fear or illness. After a long quiet moment, Emma finally turned toward him and whispered that her mother needed help. She asked if he could make sure the doctors fixed her. The trust in her voice was absolute, and it stunned him. She wasn't asking the hospital. She wasn't asking chance or fate. She was asking him. He approached the bedside and assured her that he would take care of everything, that her mother would receive the best treatment available, no matter the cost. Emma nodded slowly, leaning back toward her mother, still holding her hand. As he watched them together, Andrew realized with startling clarity that his role in Emma's life had already shifted. He wasn't just a passerby anymore or a temporary guardian. He had become her anchor in a world that had failed her too many times. She looked to him for protection, guidance, and truth. And he knew he couldn't walk away from that responsibility, not now, not ever. The nurse returned to adjust the monitors and quietly told Andrew that Emma's mother would need days, maybe weeks, to regain strength. Andrew simply nodded, already planning how he would support them through it. He wasn't leaving this child or her mother behind. Not after everything. Emma looked up at him again, eyes red from crying but calmer, as though she finally believed she wasn't alone. And for the first time since he met her, she gave him a small, tired smile, fragile but real. In that moment, Andrew understood something he hadn't dared admit before: saving Emma had already changed him, and he was willing to change even more. Andrew spent the next several days in a haze of responsibility, determination, and an unexpected kind of tenderness that emerged every time he looked at Emma. He divided his time between the hospital room where her mother lay recovering and the small waiting area where Emma sat coloring quietly, always keeping her drawings within sight of the door in case her mother woke and called for her. The doctors briefed him regularly, explaining the severity of her illness and how dangerously close she had come to collapse. They emphasized that stress, exhaustion, and lack of treatment had pushed her body to its breaking point. Andrew listened to every detail with the seriousness of a man who had decided he would not allow this woman, or her child, to slip back into danger. Emma adapted quickly to the new routine, though she still carried her suitcase everywhere as if afraid someone might take it and uproot her again. Andrew tried gently, more than once, to leave it in the hotel room where they were staying, but she refused. She said it had everything important inside, and even if she didn't open it, she needed to know it was near. He didn't argue. Instead, he made sure she always had a place to set it beside her, next to the hospital bed, next to the table in the cafe where they often stopped for dinner, beside her seat in his car. Every morning Andrew picked her up early, and she always greeted him with a shy smile that made something warm flicker in his chest. She spoke more now, sometimes telling him small stories from school or describing the dreams she had before her mother got sick. Even when her stories were interrupted by fear or doubt, she trusted him enough to keep talking. He understood that for her, each word was a small act of courage. One afternoon, as Emma sat beside her mother's hospital bed, softly reading aloud from a children's book a nurse had lent her, one of Andrew's board members called with an urgent matter. The company needed immediate decisions from him: legal issues, financial risks, a possible acquisition he had been negotiating for months. Before he met Emma, he would have answered without hesitation, diving headfirst into the corporate firestorm. But now he hesitated, glancing toward the small girl resting her head on her mother's hand as she read. He stepped into the hallway and dealt with the situation with the efficiency everyone expected from him, but something had shifted. His priorities were no longer solely tied to corporate success. His world had expanded to include two fragile lives that depended on him in ways he had never anticipated. When he returned to the hospital room, Emma looked up at him with quiet curiosity. She asked whether he had fixed the problem, and he chuckled softly, amazed at how naturally she assumed he could fix anything. He told her it was handled, and she gave a satisfied nod that made her look oddly authoritative for a 6-year-old. Then she reached for his hand without thinking, as if it were the most natural gesture in the world. He didn't pull away. Later that same day, Emma's mother had a brief moment of clarity. She woke long enough to squeeze her daughter's hand and whisper her name. Emma froze, breath catching in her throat, and then she burst into soft, relieved sobs. Andrew stepped back to give them room, but he felt a powerful ache in his chest as he watched the reunion. The woman recognized her daughter instantly, though she was too weak to speak more than a few words. When her gaze drifted to Andrew, confusion flickered in her eyes, followed by something like gratitude when Emma whispered that he had helped her. After the woman fell back asleep, Emma crawled into the chair beside the bed and sat silently, staring at her mother's peaceful face. Andrew approached and gently asked if she wanted to rest too. Emma shook her head. She didn't want to miss a moment in case her mother woke again. He respected her choice and sat quietly near her, letting her take the lead, something adults rarely did for children in distress. As evening approached, Andrew finally coaxed Emma into going back to the hotel so she could sleep properly. She resisted at first, but when he promised they would return first thing in the morning, she agreed. In the car, the city light streaked across the windows as she sat leaning against her suitcase, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. After a while, she asked quietly whether people would think badly of her mother for disappearing. Andrew told her firmly that illness was not a failure and that no one who understood the truth would blame her. Emma nodded slowly, reassured but still fragile. At the hotel, after she brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas, she hesitated before climbing into bed. She looked at him with an expression he had come to recognize, fear that the world might shift again while she slept. He told her he would remain right there in the chair until morning, just like the first night. That promise allowed her to finally lie down. After a few minutes, she whispered into the dark that she didn't want to go back to the train station ever again. He answered that she would never have to. Only when she drifted off did Andrew allow himself to process the emotions he had been suppressing. He sat silently, watching her breathe, aware of how deeply intertwined their lives had become in such a short time. He cared for her, not as a charity case, not as a temporary responsibility, but as someone he could not imagine abandoning. He wanted to protect her future, shield her from uncertainty, and ensure she never felt alone again. What surprised him most was not the intensity of his newfound role, but how natural it felt. Caring for Emma didn't feel like an obligation, it felt like a calling he hadn't known he was waiting for. The emptiness he used to feel in moments of silence was gone, replaced by something steadier, warmer, more purposeful. As he looked at her sleeping form, her hand resting on top of her little suitcase, as if afraid to let go, he realized he no longer questioned the path ahead. He knew exactly what he would do. Andrew would make sure Emma's mother recovered. He would make sure Emma never feared homelessness or hunger again. And he would remain in their lives however they needed him, not because he felt obligated, but because he wanted to, more deeply than he had ever wanted anything. Andrew woke before sunrise, his back stiff from another night spent sleeping upright in the hotel chair. For a long moment he remained still, listening to the steady rhythm of Emma's breathing as she lay curled under the blanket, her small hand resting protectively on top of her suitcase. The pale blue morning light caught the strands of her golden curls, and he felt a familiar tug in his chest, half tenderness, half ache. It struck him again how impossibly brave she was, how much fear she carried quietly, and how determined she remained not to fall apart. He wondered how a child so small had endured so much. After a quiet breakfast in the room, he helped her button her little jacket, and she held his wrist rather than his hand as they walked out of the hotel. It wasn't that she feared him, it was that she feared losing him. Her grip was light but constant, as if needing reassurance he was still there. In the car, she watched the city slide past the windows and asked, in a hushed voice, whether her mother might wake up more today. Andrew told her he believed she would. He didn't know if it was true, but he had learned that Emma didn't need false promises, she needed steady confidence, something solid to lean on. At the hospital, they were met with news that the woman had regained longer stretches of consciousness during the night. Emma's face lit up with hope and fear all at once, creating an expression so raw that Andrew had to steady her by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She practically ran to the room, stopping only when she reached the doorframe. She looked back at him, her eyes searching his, silently asking him to come inside with her. He did. Her mother was awake, though weak, and when she saw Emma, the woman's eyes filled with tears. Emma approached slowly, as though afraid her mother might fade away if she moved too quickly. When their hands touched, both of them exhaled a trembling breath that was almost a sob. For the first time, Emma's mother managed to speak clearly. She apologized for leaving, for scaring her daughter, for everything she couldn't control. Emma nodded through tears, saying she wasn't mad, only scared. Andrew stepped back to give them space but remained near enough that Emma could see him when she looked around in moments of sudden panic. He felt the role he held, protector, stability, a kind of temporary parent, more strongly than ever before. The doctor entered after a while, explaining that the woman's diagnosis was severe but treatable. She would need weeks of care, possibly longer, and full recovery would depend on rest and consistent medication. Emma's mother's face twisted with guilt, she whispered that they couldn't afford any of that. Before Emma could even form a worried thought, Andrew stepped forward and assured the doctor, in a calm and confident tone, that every cost would be covered. The doctor nodded with gratitude, but Emma's mother looked startled, almost frightened by the generosity. She tried to protest, insisting they couldn't accept that, but Andrew gently cut her off, saying Emma deserved stability and safety, not fear or financial ruin. Emma watched this exchange with wide, uncertain eyes. She seemed torn between relief and confusion, as though she didn't fully understand why a powerful man would help people like her. When the doctor left, she whispered softly to him, asking whether he was really going to stay until her mommy got better. Andrew knelt beside her chair so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. He told her he wasn't going anywhere. She leaned into his shoulder without hesitation, and he felt her small body relax for the first time since morning. Throughout the day, Emma spent hours reading to her mother, telling her about school, about her drawings, about the train station, though she left out the parts that were too frightening. Her mother listened with a mixture of sadness and pride, squeezing her daughter's hand whenever she could. Andrew stayed in the background, handling phone calls quietly, coordinating treatments with the doctors, and arranging support services. His company could function perfectly well without him for a few days, and the board members, though surprised, knew better than to question his priorities. At one point, Emma walked over to him and climbed onto the chair beside him, leaning against his arm as though it were the most natural place for her to rest. She told him that her mommy was getting better because he was helping. He didn't correct her by crediting the doctors, he simply placed a comforting hand on her back, letting her believe in the stability she felt. Children needed anchors, and he was becoming hers. Later in the afternoon, her mother asked to speak with Andrew alone. Emma reluctantly stepped into the hallway, her suitcase in hand, but she pressed her ear to the door just enough to reassure herself he wasn't leaving. Inside, the woman thanked him with a quiet trembling in her voice and admitted she didn't know how to repay him. Andrew told her repayment wasn't needed. He explained gently that Emma reminded him of what truly mattered in life, that helping them wasn't a burden but something he wanted to do. Her eyes softened, and she whispered that Emma trusted him, something she didn't do easily. When Emma re-entered the room, she rushed to her mother's side, but her mother pushed a lock of hair from her daughter's forehead and said, with surprising strength, "He's a good man, sweetheart. You can trust him." Emma looked up at Andrew with an expression he had seen developing slowly over the past days, one that combined gratitude, reliance, and something deeper, the beginning of true security. That evening, Andrew and Emma walked out of the hospital hand in hand. She was tired, emotionally drained, and unusually quiet, but her steps were steady. She no longer looked like a child lost in the world. She looked like a child who finally had someone to walk beside her. On the drive back to the hotel, Emma asked whether she and her mommy could stay somewhere warm when her mommy got out of the hospital. Then, timidly, she asked whether Andrew would still visit them. He glanced at her in the mirror and saw hope flickering behind her exhaustion. "I won't disappear from your life, Emma," he said gently. She hugged her suitcase and whispered, "Good. I don't want you to." As he parked the car, a realization settled over him with absolute clarity: he wasn't just helping temporarily. He was building a place for himself in Emma's life, and perhaps in her mother's, one decision at a time. A new future was taking shape, fragile but unmistakably real. In the days that followed, Emma's mother continued to grow stronger, though her body healed more slowly than her daughter's spirit. Emma no longer carried her suitcase everywhere, though she still kept it beside her bed at night, a reminder of the fear she had survived. Andrew noticed how she began to laugh again, softly at first, then with more confidence, as though rediscovering parts of herself she had buried beneath weeks of uncertainty. She drew pictures for her mother, for the nurses, even one for Andrew, a crayon sketch of him standing beside her and holding her hand. When she shyly handed it to him, his chest tightened with a feeling he hadn't expected, something warm and anchoring that whispered he was now part of her world in a way he couldn't ever step back from. As her mother healed, the doctors began discussing discharge plans. She would need a long period of recovery, rest, medication, and stable housing. The words "stable housing" hung heavily in the air, because Emma and her mother had been living in a cramped, unsafe apartment that offered neither stability nor security. Before the social worker could even present options, Andrew calmly announced that he had taken care of accommodations. He had secured a furnished apartment in a safe neighborhood close to the hospital, stocked with food, clothing, and everything Emma might need. Emma's mother stared at him in disbelief, overwhelmed by a gratitude she didn't know how to express. But Andrew wasn't finished. As he spoke to the social worker, he made arrangements for home care nurses, therapy, and financial assistance. Emma's mother tried to refuse, insisting she didn't want to rely on charity. Andrew met her gaze with understanding and explained that this wasn't charity, it was support freely given because Emma deserved a life without fear, without instability, without constant battles to survive. When Emma overheard bits of the conversation, her brow furrowed in worry. She tugged on Andrew's sleeve and asked in a trembling voice whether he was going to stop helping once her mommy left the hospital. He knelt beside her again, brushing a curl gently away from her cheek, and assured her that nothing about his commitment would change. She asked if he promised, and he said yes, without hesitation. Only then did she accept his answer, leaning into his arms with the trust of a child who had finally found someone she believed would stay. The day her mother was discharged arrived quietly, without tears or speeches, but with an undercurrent of relief that filled the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emma insisted on helping the nurse wheel her mother out of the hospital, gripping the handles proudly with her tiny hands. Andrew walked beside them, carrying bags and paperwork, but more than that, carrying the weight of everything he had chosen to take responsibility for. When they arrived at the apartment he had prepared, Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the bright living room, the soft couch, the framed prints on the walls, and the small bedroom furnished just for her. She explored every corner, touching things gently as though worried they might vanish if she pressed too hard. Her mother watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes, whispering that she had never imagined a place like this for them. Andrew didn't mention the cost or the effort it had taken, he only said that they deserved safety and comfort. Nothing more needed to be explained. As the first evening settled in their new home, Emma's mother rested while Emma helped Andrew unpack a few final boxes. She talked more openly than she had in days, asking him small questions about his life, his work, whether he liked dogs or cats, whether he had ever been scared when he was little. He answered honestly, realizing she had come to trust his presence not as a stranger, but as something closer to family. When she finished arranging her books on the shelf, she looked up at him with shining eyes and said softly, "Thank you for not leaving me." The words hit him harder than he expected. He reached out and rested a hand on her shoulder, telling her he wasn't leaving now, and he wouldn't leave ever. She nodded solemnly, absorbing the promise with the seriousness of a child who knew too well what it felt like to be abandoned. Later that night, after Emma had fallen asleep in her new room, Andrew sat with her mother at the small kitchen table. She thanked him again, her voice unsteady, but he shook his head, saying the gratitude belonged to Emma for showing him what truly mattered in life. Her mother studied him for a long moment, then whispered that she could see how much he cared for her daughter. Andrew didn't deny it, he simply admitted that Emma had changed him. She had softened the sharp edges of his world, given meaning to parts of his life he hadn't realized were hollow, and reminded him that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. As he prepared to leave for the night, Emma stirred in the hallway, rubbing her tired eyes. She padded toward him and reached for his hand. He bent down, and she whispered, "Are you coming back tomorrow?" He smiled and told her he would be there in the morning. She hugged him tightly, surprising both of them with the strength of her small arms. When he finally stepped into the cool night air, he felt an unexpected peace settle inside him. The city around him buzzed with movement and noise, but his thoughts were calm, centered on the two lives waiting upstairs. He realized he had crossed a threshold he could never uncross, not because he felt obligated, but because he had found something he didn't know he had been searching for. He didn't just want to help them. He wanted to stay. He wanted to build something new, with them. And as he walked to his car beneath the glow of the street lamps, He understood that the story that began on a snowy train station platform was no longer about rescue. It had become a story about belonging, hers, and unexpectedly, his own.